Well, hello, and thank you all so much for coming. And I am Dr. Raymond Moody, and I am so delighted to be here. In the interest of full disclosure, I must say at the very beginning, my brother-in-law, who is married to my wife's sister, and even before that, Melvin Morris and I have been friends now for 30 plus years, and Melvin has made really magnificent studies over the years on the near-death experiences of children. So rather than talking myself, I am really interested to hear from my brother-in-law and dear friend, Dr. Melvin Morse. So Mel, I would like to know about how you became interested in near-death experiences. What happened?
Well, Raymond, I had the same kind of very traditional medical training that you had. I trained at Johns Hopkins, where, we sort of thought family practice docs were quacks.
Yes.
So that very sort of rigorous, skeptical mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So I certainly was not in any way prepared to really know anything about near-death experiences. When I was training at Seattle Children's Hospital, I had never read your books or really never even heard of them before. And I came to resuscitate a young girl, Crystal Merslock, in Pocatello, Idaho. And she drowned in a community swimming pool. And a local physician happened to be there with his children, Chuck Harden, and he resuscitated her, right there, which is, probably what saved her life. And then since I was down there from Seattle Children's Hospital, they called me in from home to come in and resuscitate her. And she was a very, very difficult resuscitation. She certainly was as close to death as you can be. I had told her parents that I thought for certain that she would die. And they were very devout Mormons. So they formed a prayer circle around her, and I'm like, they might as well, why not, it's my opinion, what good prayer would do her. And she was sent down to Primary Children's Hospital, and then she made a full recovery. Amazing, really. Within a week, she was fully awake and aware and conscious. And it's interesting. The first words she said to her nurses on regaining consciousness, she says, "Where's Mark and Adam?" And they didn't know what she was talking about, but I'll tell you the significance of that in a little bit. So she came back to Pocatello, where I happened to be working in the community clinic there, and she happened to see me in the hallway, and she says, "There's the guy that put a tube in my nose." And since I knew that not only were her eyes fixed and dilated, but we taped their eyes closed, so they won't get injured with the hubbub of resuscitation. So I knew she hadn't actually seen that, and so, but I was intrigued, and I went in there and I talked to her and her mother, and I said to her, "Well, hi, Crystal. I'm sure you don't remember me, but I remember you." And she turns to her mother and she says, "Oh no, I know all about him." And she described her own resuscitation in great detail. She says accurately little comments that the nurses made. Then you took and put me in a machine that looked like a donut, which was her description of a CAT scanner. And all of this was during the time she was clinically dead. So she heard me talking to the doctors at Children's Hospital for advice, everything. So, but still, I'm like, what? Sort of like, come on, what is this? And she reaches over and she takes my hand like this and she pats my wrist and she says, "You'll see, Dr. Morse, heaven is fun." So, but Kelly will show you a picture that she drew me. I had her draw me a picture of what was heaven. All righty. So, at this time, I had no, this to me seemed like a very traditional child's drawing of heaven. There she is, and there's flowers, and, it seems like, okay, so, that's what a child would think heaven was. But then she told me that she could see through a hole to earth. And she said that this was her brother. And notice he has a very large heart. She draws this large heart in his chest. And that's fine, And she said that that's why she came back to earth. Mm-hmm. And she said that Mark and Andy, the boys that she mentioned to the nurses, that they were her playmates in heaven. Wow. That they were children who had previously died as well. Mm-hmm. So she drew me this picture, and she said that she had to go back and help her mother her mother was pregnant, but they didn't know anything about the child. They didn't even know the child's sex. And she said this was a boy who was to be born with a heart problem. Mm-hmm. So about 3 months later, sure enough, Mrs. Merzlock gave birth to a child, and sure enough, that boy had a heart problem. And that's when I started to believe in near-death experiences. Yeah. Because, the rest of it, I didn't know what to make of it. The accurate description of her own resuscitation. Well, the patients wax in and out of consciousness. We don't really know what, they might be in coma 1 minute. They might be awake the next. We don't really know. And, and all those kinds of things. But when she drew me that picture, and then 3 months later, the events in it came true.
Yeah. Incidentally, Mel has the most phenomenal collection of drawings of near-death experiences from kids. If there's any way, you should get really published those.
Yeah,
you must have added considerably to your collection.
Dozens of these pictures. But this girl's experience is why I met you, Raymond.
Yeah.
Now, this is the story that my mother tells.
Okay.
So let's see. now this will be my chance to see if it's true or not. Okay. So I published Crystal Merzlock's story, her case.
Journal of Critical Care Medicine or something.
Yeah, it's an American Medical Association's pediatric journal. And
that was in 85, as I remember.
Right. And my mom goes to all these kinds of conferences, and we all kind of, my crazy mom. And she went to one of your conferences.
Oh, I see.
And she heard you talking about near-death experiences. Mm-hmm. And her story is that she talked to you afterwards, and she says to you, that's nothing. My son, the doctor, my son, the doctor, he hears these kinds of experiences from children all the time.
That's interesting because I knew your mom and loved your mom and knew her very well. But the way I remember it was that I'd heard about the article you wrote.
Right. Yeah.
And so I flew out to Seattle and just not even announced. I just came. Right. We got together. That was in 1988, as I recall.
And you and I talked for the whole weekend. Mm-hmm. And for people who wonder how the universe works, that people that have near-death experiences tell us that there's no coincidences or anything like that. Listen to this. So Raymond comes to visit me. And he got there on, a Thursday, Friday night, and we talked nonstop till Monday morning. To the point where we would fall asleep in the chair and wake up the next morning. And then start talking again.
That's right. And it was wonderful.
So I was called into the hospital to resuscitate a child.
That's right.
And you came in with me, and we're talking all the way in, talking away. And then, you couldn't come back, but I went in and I resuscitated this young man. And sure enough, after we resuscitated him, he dramatically opens his eyes and he says, that was weird. Mm-hmm. You guys just sucked me back into my body.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It's true. And it's once you open your eyes to these things, they quickly become everywhere.
Yeah.
I guess the comment all the time is, oh, Dr. Moody, you were so courageous to bring this out. Well, that's baloney. By 1974, when I wrote that book, I knew full well that anybody who would just look around among their own friends and would find cases of this.
But Raymond, you're really underestimating yourself, Because when I went back to Seattle Children's Hospital and I told them the story of Crystal Merslock, we decided at Seattle Children's Hospital that we would do a formal study.
Oh yeah, I
these
remember
experiences.
that. I remember that.
We would study them, in the scientific way. We would not allow people to come to us and tell us stories, but in fact, what we did was we identified all survivors of cardiac arrest at Seattle Children's Hospital, and then we went and interviewed them. So, but I worked with the head of the intensive care unit, Don Tyler. I worked with the head of the Department of Neurology, was Jerry Milstein. I worked with the head of the Department of Neuropsychiatry at the University of Washington, Vernon Neppy, and we couldn't have done that. I couldn't have enlisted this quality of man, except that I was able to say, but look at this work that Raymond Moody has already done. So you broke the ice for this second generation. Your work was, people coming to you and telling you stories, but then you set the stage for us to do a much more formal study. Where, we went through the, University of Washington's Human Subject Review Committee, and we wouldn't have been able to do that if we weren't able to justify to them, why we would do such a thing, interview survivors of cardiac arrest. It was unheard of at the time. And we wanted to do a formal scientific study to see are near-death experiences real. And quite frankly, we thought we were going to prove you wrong. We did. We wanted to look at the issues of were these things caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain? Are they hallucinations? Are they caused by the many medications that we give patients during cardiac arrest, resuscitation? We wanted to look at all those issues. We wanted to know whether is an invention of the mind, after the fact of coming back, just the natural instinct to, wow, I must have been in heaven, or were these real experiences that will happen to us all when we die? And we studied all survivors of cardiac arrest at Children's over about a 15-year period. We published our findings in all the prestigious medical journals. We had no difficulty publishing our findings. Current Problems of Pediatrics, which was very, and in every doctor's office in the country, devoted a whole issue to our findings, because we determined that in fact near-death experiences are real. That they are in fact what will happen to us all when we die. And just to hear these experiences from children.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, as a matter of fact, about that. It's like, and I know you've talked to a lot of adults with near-death experiences as well. Two things. Number one, how are the near-death experiences of kids different from those of adults, if they are? And secondly, I know that you have followed many of these patients for decades now. And so I'd like to know about how a near-death experience at an early age plays out in that person's subsequent life.
Well, first is that the child's near-death experience is very immediate. It's very honest. It doesn't have a lot of embellishment. And there's a quality to it that you just don't see in the adult near-death experience. And, I'll give you an example. We resuscitated this one girl who had fulminant mononucleosis and liver failure. And she was resuscitated. And so she was part of our study. So 2 months later, I went out and interviewed her. And to my great surprise, everybody on our team's surprise, she said, "Oh yeah, I saw you, bringing that crash cart into the room." And she even saw me putting a needle into her heart, which was necessary for her resuscitation. So these are patients that are truly near death when you have to inject medications in their heart to resuscitate them. And she says to me, and it was so weird, my grandmother was there. Of course, her grandmother wasn't there. And she said, I was just so shocked to see her. and she drew me a picture, of her grandmother who had passed, in this big circle of light, sitting in a chair. And it's just so honest. There's no embellishment. She just says, it was so weird. I was just sitting here. I was in my bed, and my grandmother was just sitting next to me. And then she says, and then I was back. So I said, so what do you mean by that? And she clenches her little fist and she goes, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Whereas an adult would tell us a much more formed story, and children tell these little fragments of powerful experiences. I'll just share with you another one. It was a young girl that my partner resuscitated. And, again, describing all the accurate details of her own resuscitation. And she said that she met Jesus. And for the Christians in the audience, you'll be pleased to know that he's very nice. But then she says to me, I saw a light. And it was a light that told me who I am and where I was to go.
Wow.
And we just hear these incredibly powerful things from children.
Yeah.
And these are all children, remember, that we have interviewed. We identified them as being near death, and then we went to them.
Yes.
And most of them hadn't even told their parents or anybody of the experience. And this one child said to me, I said to her, well, so why didn't you tell anybody about your experience? And she goes, I didn't think you were supposed to be able to talk to God. So even at her age, she knows, in our society, we think you're crazy to talk to God.
Most of the people I talked with who had near-death experiences as kids, I was interviewing them later in life, although there have been maybe half a dozen or so kids that I talked with. And what struck me about the ones was that they seemed more mature than their age.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, They almost seem like little adults.
Yeah, like little mini saints. That's what I think of them as little mini mystics. But, I'm going to answer your second question, because we then did a formal study of the long-term consequences of having a near-death experience as a child. But the results of our study were startling. We studied 26 survivors of cardiac arrest, and 24 of them had a near-death experience. We then studied hundreds of survivors of very serious illnesses, but not near death, but also with a lack of oxygen to the brain, mechanically ventilated in the scary intensive care unit, every reason to psychologically have this experience if that's what caused them, treated with all the various medications, and none of those children had any kind of memory at all. Those are the ones that fit with what, conventional neuroscience is that they lost their short-term memory. Most of them don't even remember being in the hospital. And our study was rigorous enough that we were able to publish it in the American Medical Association's pediatric journals. So, and then Dr. von Lummel from the University of Utrecht, he followed up our study with a more formal study in adults and found the exact same thing. Yes. So science tells us that near-death experiences are real. But I'm going to answer your question. I got to just tell you one more story. Because remember I told you that 24 out of the 26 children had the neardeath experience. Mm-hmm. So here's one child that was a negative in our study. So I went out to visit her. I got permission from her parents to interview them. And I go out and I interview them. And here's her story. She and her father were on fishing in Lake Washington in Seattle. And a sudden wind came up and she was fooling around the way a child does, standing in the boat and everything, and flipped and sank into the murky depths. So the father is panicked and he free dives to try to find her. And of course he can't because it's murky. And he, there was another man was with him as well, and both of them are frantically diving.
And then they both reported that suddenly her body was lit with a bright light.
Yeah.
That her body, a light came out of it, and that they were able to then locate her because of this light. And then they pulled her back up, and she went to Seattle Children's Hospital to the intensive care unit where we successfully resuscitated her.
I've seen that light many times, and I suspect you have, in dying patients.
Yeah.
Just before they die,
Right.
they will flash this light, not like coming from these light bulbs,
But she
have
had
to
no
call
memory
it
of her
light.
experience.
Yeah.
So she had to be a negative.
Yeah, exactly.
We had to check the box, did not
She
have a
did
near
not
death
have
experience. And it's interesting, her father was so sort of, he's trying to struggle. Everyone who has these experiences, including, those of us who study them, we're struggling to understand, how can this really be true?
Yes.
So he and the other gentleman rented scuba gear, and they went back the next day to Lake Washington, and they went down and they sat on the bottom of the lake. And they just sat there for a couple of hours because they wanted to see, what was that like? Was it just some weird stray, some optic that allowed, a stray sunbeam to come through? And they told me that absolutely it was total darkness. So that's one of the negatives of my, that one we had to report as negative. But so to answer your second question, we then studied the patients in our study for, another, 10 years or so, and looked at them as they became adults. And then we also studied around 100 adults who had near-death experiences as children.
Mm-hmm.
And we submitted them to a whole battery of psychological tests, personality profiles, death anxiety tests. We looked at their tax returns. We interviewed them. We interviewed family members. And basically, we discovered my bias was, are these people crazy? I mean, the people that you see, you always kind of wonder, what's going on with them. And we found that people have it's good for you to have a near-death experience. That we had careful controls, and we found that first of all, they had very little death anxiety. They're not frightened, and they had an unusual zest for living. So they love to live, and they are not afraid to die. They gave more money to charity than our control populations. They are more likely to be in the helping professions, and they psychologically were far healthier, much less anxiety, much less depression. Interestingly, much less prescription drugs, but interestingly enough, statistically significantly less use of over-the-counter drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just lived vibrant, wonderful lives. It's like having a near-death experience. You would get a post-traumatic bliss syndrome, so to speak.
They become more internal.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
And spend a lot of time meditation, such as that. I got to tell you one funny story. Was one of the members of our study. I was counseling his grandson on having his tonsils out, and what he could expect from this after the tonsils out. And I was telling him you get to eat ice cream and all of that. Meanwhile, his grandfather is saying to me, "Tell him about the tunnel. Tell him about the tunnel." and I'm like, what? Looking in my, not really, but, checking my textbooks. Is that a side effect of having your tonsils out? But sure enough, I enrolled him in my study because he provided me with his medical records. He was in Concrete, Washington. He'd had a tonsillectomy some 60 years before, when they were using ether as an anesthetic agent. And sure enough, he had a cardiac arrest during his tonsillectomy. And he described, going down a tunnel, coming out on this beautiful beach where there's just warm, wonderful sunshine, and a light that told him, that the meaning of life is to love each other. And he lived a life of love by every indication in talking with his family members. So, we learn how to live from
Yes.
having the near-death experience.
So true. So true.
If I can I
Yeah.
tell you one more story?
Yeah,
I don't want
absolutely.
to, well, it's just these, when you hear these stories from children, you understand something that you could read. I've read, Tibetan, texts and spiritual books, and yet you hear it from a child. Or, this was one of the children that I resuscitated. He told me that part of his near-death experience was that he was told, "Go back, Bobby, you have a job to do." So I interviewed him when he was in his 20s. And, still, a young man then. I'm still, not quite sure what all this means. And I was like, oh God, go back, you have a job to do. All right, I'll bite. What's your job? Find a cure for cancer, or, what is it? And he looks at me and he said, "I already told you what my job was." He said, "I run a little construction company." He said, "Those numbnuts that I hire, they wouldn't know what to do without me."
Yeah.
But that taught me, that humbled me,
Yes.
because what that taught me was,
It's not about me.
right.
Yeah.
And he was sent back to run a small construction company.
Yeah.
That the meaning of and he clearly, in his mind, he did it because either of his high school friends that he thought were otherwise unemployable, and yet had a very successful company. And that this was why he came back from his near-death experience, not for some exalted purpose, not to
Yes.
found a religion, not to convince people that there is a God or that there isn't a God, or the truth of his experience, or any of those kinds of things. In fact, the only reason he came to our attention was that he was part of my study.
Mm-hmm.
And that taught me that, that's why we're here on earth. We're here to learn our lessons of love. We're here to do our jobs, however, whatever that job might be.
I'm interested. A lot of adults have panoramic reviews of their lives during their near. How common is that in kids' near-death experiences?
I just never heard a life review.
Never heard.
Yeah, I never. The only thing that came close was one young man who he had numerous surgeries for kidney problems.
Mm-hmm.
And after we resuscitated him, I was up on the ward, and he looks at me with this really mean look. He goes, "Where's my Jesus?" And I'm like, he said, "You took my Jesus away." I was like, sorry, we thought we were doing our job, but that's his.
So he
spirit.
didn't want to come back.
Yeah, he didn't want to come back. And but he told me that when he had that out of body phrase, suddenly he saw all of his operations.
Yeah.
And suddenly suddenly it all fit into perspective for him. That there was a sense that there was a meaning to his life. Which is what the adults, well, you tell me, what the adults that you've seen tell you the same thing, I'm sure.
Well, yeah.
That life has a meaning.
Life has a meaning. And as with your patient there, people say that it's not, that your mission is not to come back and save Sudan or to, it's with the people that you know.
Yeah.
And,
Now, I published my studies primarily because I felt that parents needed to know this information. Yeah. And it was very gratifying to me that the letters, that was back in the day, when we actually got letters in the mail.
Yes.
And I would get hundreds of letters from parents who would say, "Thank you for reassuring me that my child's final moments weren't painful."
Exactly.
And they would describe what the intensive care unit was from their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
They would say things like, "I always felt guilty that I let you doctors take him back, after I saw all the things that you did to him, but thank you for letting me know that that during that time the child is out of the body, is perceiving as something very different.
This is very comforting to people. And the first time I lectured on this was in 1970. And it was at first in college classes and then civic clubs. But I quickly realized that at the civic clubs, there would always be somebody there who would come up and say, Dr. Moody, I've never told anybody this, but and tell their experience. But there were also always people there who had not had a near-death experience themselves, but who were looking to this information as some sort of comfort and over the loss of a loved one. And I think it does give people comfort to hear these things.
Well, as one girl said to me, she said, to her own surprise, she said, I wasn't dead. I wasn't dead at all. I was alive. Some part of me was still alive.
Yeah.
And I think that my research and your research and the research of dozens of other medical scientists really tells us that the whole realm of spiritual experiences surrounding death and dying are real.
Yeah.
By showing that the near-death experience is real, then the after-death communication, when the mother is grieving, or the father is grieving, and the child comes back and says, Mom, I'm okay. You don't need to cry. Those experiences are often dismissed as crazy hallucinations or grief-induced hallucinations, as the literature tells us. But if the near-death experience is real, then the after-death experience, the after-death communication is just as real.
Yeah, I think you came to that a little earlier than I did, because before I went into medicine, I was in philosophy, and you're taught to doubt everything, and that. So it's been a long time coming from me, Mel, but just in the last 3, 4, 5 years, I've come to that same position that, to my utter astonishment, this is real.
Yeah.
It is.
The premonition of death, the after-death communication, they're all part of the incredible spiritual events that surround death and dying. Yeah. And I felt I feel honored. Like, these are sacred stories, and I feel honored to be able to share them and to let people know that that dying is not painful, even though it may look that way. One thing that I learned from children, you can tell me if this is with adults, is that universally there's a comfort, some sort of comfort object or comfort person who accompanies the child during the dying experience. One boy told me it was his dog who had previously died. Mm-hmm. He said to me, I saw this light and I wanted to go to a light, but the dog nagged at me and made it seem like I shouldn't go.
Yeah.
So that kind of experience.
In the Western cultures, the dog is the psychopomp animal.
Interesting.
Like the animal that carries you across and I know in different parts of the world, in the shamanic cultures of Siberia, for example, the psychopomp animal is the horse.
Interesting. Yeah. That's I had this is a pre-death vision, but a patient of mine who was dying in the intensive care unit, and I was there with the nurses and his parents, and then he very dramatically looks up and says, the horse is coming for me. Wow. And then he died a few seconds later.
Amazing.
But there's so many things about these experiences which are odd or actually make me laugh. And I want to share another one with you. I resuscitated this one teenage girl. She this was back in the days before this is why we have GFI switches in our bathrooms, because she was listening to music with her radio and then knocked it into the tub and electrocuted herself but we successfully resuscitated her. And this is why we can't really, I think, be too narrow about what's a near-death experience, because she didn't have what you would call a near-death experience. She says to me, she says, "Thank you very much for that nurse that sat with me during the resuscitation." And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, "You know, that nurse, that woman who was all dressed in white, who held my hand while you were doing all those things to me." And, you know, we actually don't have that service at the intensive care unit at Seattle Children's Hospital. we don't have nurses that just sit there. You know, she was seeing, you know, that was her, that was her comfort spirit.
Guide or
Her
spirit.
guide. But, you know, she didn't have any of the other elements of the near-death experience, but she had that very vivid experience.
I want to know about your current research. What are you doing now?
So one of the things, you know, what I always want to do, I'm inspired by this young man who we resuscitated him. He was underwater, I think, for about 45 minutes. And, you know, an example of the intensive care unit's axiom that, you know, if you're not warm and dead, you're not dead. You know, so this is a cold water drowning. And it's great to hear these experiences from children, because they're not pre-programmed the way so many of the adult experiences are. He says to me, "I was in the huge noodle." And then I said, I just looked at him like, you know, what? And he said, no, it couldn't have been a noodle. It must have been a tunnel, because noodles don't have rainbows in them. You know, and that's just the kind of thing you wouldn't hear from an adult.
That's right.
You know, and also it made me feel like I'm just really one of the most blessed people alive. And it's one of the reasons I want to share this information, because then after that, after he talks to his parents and other people, then he's just saying, "I was in the tunnel." It's only that first telling when he's trying to struggle to understand this. "I was in the noodle, but wait a minute, noodles don't have tunnels." So after his successful, he went to the human heaven, by the way. First he was in the animal heaven, and then he was in the human heaven. But he says to me, "But was it real, Dr. Morse? Because if it was real, you've got to tell all the old people." And so that's what, you know, so our first research was to say, is this experience real? And then the research that I'm doing now, I'm looking at this issue of the alternate reality that we experience as part of the near-death experience is, you know, once the ego dies, there is something, as one of my children, you know, I've said, some part of me is still alive. And they describe this reality as having no time, no space, having all information. They feel like they know everything. All the knowledge in the universe is all wrapped up in a ball of light, is what one.
Wow.
I know, isn't that the most beautiful things that they say? And so as a result of that, I was trained in remote viewing. And I was fortunate enough that my near-death work gave me an entree into the military remote viewers, who, as you know, are the real deal. You know, the United States military remote viewers can really do it. And I just, you know, that's just a little piece of the near-death experience. You know, is there really a reality that we can enter into, which is all information, no time, no space, and is filled with a sense of unconditional love? In the process of remote viewing, you know, the ability to gain information through non-ordinary means, to gain information not using your ordinary senses, and then you can validate that information by, you know, if you're seeing, let's say, a building on the other side of the world through remote viewing, you can then get a picture of that building, and you can make sure, hey, wait a minute, I got this right, I didn't get this right, etc. And so at least that one piece of the near-death experience is clearly real.
Then the next piece has to be some way to have a procedure for the transcendental side of this. I mean, to get information about the physical environment is one thing, but we don't yet have the way to get people to bring information back from the transcendental parts of this.
Right.
That lift up above the physical.
But I've been studying this now for almost 30 years. And, as a scientist, I can tell you that science does help us to understand the near-death experience. I think that, science is not against spirituality, as I once thought, but that you have a better understanding of spirituality if you understand the science of how the brain works and what I call spiritual neuroscience. But then there comes a point where you do have to put the science behind, and it is a matter of faith.
At least for now. It's like the trouble is we don't have a rational method that we can use to talk about transcendental things.
I understand what you're saying, but really what I've learned, particularly from the work of Lisa Smart, is that there's a unique language
Yes.
in the dying process. It's a very personal language that speaks to the individual. And there's an aspect of near-death experiences that really you either are going to believe it or you're not going to believe it.
Mm.
One question that, I'm often asked, and people, do atheists always become believers as part of the near-death experience? The answer is no. Many people have the near-death experience and it doesn't speak to them. They themselves dismiss it as some sort of crazy hallucination. You have to, we're here on this earth to learn our individual lessons of love. And spiritual experiences speak to the individual heart, and they use a language, which usually is a highly personal language, which is, let's face it, I think that's why there's a lot of these, religious wars, and, we don't understand this person's religion. And oftentimes we don't understand another person's spiritual experience because it's in a language that they can only understand. And I'll give you something very challenging. I was interviewed a young girl who nearly died of a diabetic coma, had a blood sugar that when she came in of 1,700, which typically is not compatible with survival. And she told me that her living teacher and her classmates came and sang to her and comforted her while we were resuscitating her.
Wow.
So, we've always heard about dead relatives. We've always heard, and so I think if you don't understand how personal the spiritual experience is, then you could be of the mindset of going, well, that must have been a hallucination. I mean, obviously her living teachers weren't there. Her living classmates were not in the room. I know that. I was in there the entire time. But for her, that's how this spiritual experience presented to her. As you know, a 7-year-old child, they're often crazy about their teacher, and she doesn't have any dead relatives. And so that's how this experience presents to her, and that's how the language touches her heart. And maybe another person can't understand that.
You were using that word personal. And when I was first interviewing people in the late 60s, early 70s, you would understand why people would be reluctant to talk about this, because some of them would say, because I tried to tell my doctor about it and he was telling me I was crazy, and I tried to tell my minister about it and he said, you better talk to your doctor about that. And so, but those were reasons that people gave for why they had not talked about it before. But a lot of them just said, because the experience is very personal. Right. That was the reason why they had.
Yeah, and I can understand that.
So this is a good time for each of you to wrap up, because we've got lots of great questions.
Lots of great questions. All right. Well, may I just close with one question?
Sure.
Have you, in your mind, determined that there is an afterlife?
Absolutely. That's the most rational. I know that you're always looking for the rational, but let's think about it rationally now. People, when they die, in studies going back to 1966, the first study on near-death experiences in the American Heart Association's journal, Heart. documented that this experience happens to the dying. It's not a hallucination or invention of the mind. It's a real experience that happens to you. So when you die, you have the experience of leaving your body, having an expanded sense of consciousness. So, well, I was always trained that when you die, since the brain creates consciousness, then your consciousness stops, as it within coma or, such as that. That is not the case. That when the brain dies, consciousness becomes expanded, as if the brain is some sort of a reducing valve that takes consciousness and allows us to then have this experience. And that's what people report to us when they die. There would be no reason to think that this is some sort of bizarre hallucination at the point of death. I mean, why would the evolution, why would we evolve a complex hallucination at the point of death? That a dying dysfunctional brain, which is trying to preserve all its resources, would suddenly put resources into something that wasn't real.
Yeah.
And there can be, I don't think, I mean, remember, science can only, today's scientific fact is, disproved tomorrow. So, it's to me, in the year 2019, it's a scientific fact that near-death experiences are real and strongly imply that consciousness survives death. There's no getting around that.
All right.
Yes, good. So we have some questions, and thank you very much for your questions, folks.
So number one, what positive changes do these children after the near-death experience now exhibit?
Yeah.
You mentioned some of them.
Well, we did a study at the University of Washington with Vernon Neppy, who was the director of neuropsychiatry at the time. And we documented, we found something very interesting. We looked at children who survived near fatal events but did not have a near-death experience. And because we thought that would be the perfect control group. I mean, maybe just coming to the point of death then gives you a new appreciation for life. And we compared them to adults who had near-death experiences in the context of near fatal events. We looked at their medical records, etc. And there are numerous positive effects from having a near-death experience. Much less depression, a zest for living, a sense that all of life is interconnected. And then the most profound thing that I've learned personally from studying near-death experiences is that we're here for a reason. And that reason is to learn lessons of love. And one patient told it to me the best. He said to me, life is about learning to love like that. The love that he experienced in his near-death experience. And then he said, and maybe even more to the point, to be able to learn to be loved by like that, to accept the love that others have for us. So this universe is clearly one that is made of love. And I mean, weapons of war are made of love, is what those who've had near-death experiences on the battlefield tell me.
Number two here, can you speak on prenatal near-death experience? What are elements in the prenatal NDEs? Is it a common phenomenon that is reported? And do people need some kind of regression to recall them? So have either of you had experience with that?
I have heard people who had cardiac arrest in infancy and who later were able to recall from me that event. Yeah, and of course by the theories of memory that shouldn't be. But,
right. Yeah, of course. Well, the first thing I want to just quickly get out of the way is that regression therapy, I think, is very fraught with the possibility of the therapist inducing memories in the person who's being regressed. So I think that regression therapy can give good results, but I think that requires a very, very skilled practitioner to avoid contaminating the experience. Having said that, prenatal experiences are the best collection of them is a physician out of in the Netherlands. She published an extensive collection of really memories that children have of the prenatal events. And it's striking how they're exactly like the near-death experience, except in reverse. And they often describe making a choice of who they're going to choose to be their parents. Fitting with what I've learned, that we're here to learn lessons of love. And that oftentimes it seems from the research that we've heard that this is something that is decided on before birth. So how do you get this information though, without regression therapy? By and large, this information comes from children who are age 2 or 3. And I'd like to remind the viewers, or if you're not aware of it, from a developmental perspective, children who are age 2 and 3 are very concrete thinkers, and they just tell you what they know. So really the storytelling and invention of stories involves a much higher complex developmental stage, and usually not seen to age 4 or age 5. So think about it. The average 2-year-old, when they run into the wall, they say, "The wall hit me," which is actually true. The wall did hit them. And they sort of lack the ability to speak about it from a objective or theoretical point of view. And so this information on prenatal experiences, as well as reincarnation experiences, done primarily at the University of Virginia. Ian Stevenson, and who's doing that work now?
Oh my goodness.
But that's very solid scientific work, published again in the medical journals and scientific journals. This idea that, I know people like to roll their eyes, go, "Oh, reincarnation work." That's because they're not familiar with the literature. And the literature is extremely, they used to describe Ian Stevenson as having the zeal of a prosecuting attorney when he would investigate these stories. But these stories can be believed when they come from children age 2 and age 3, and then before the age of fabrication.
All right, we have another one. Do children with near-death experiences come back with a higher IQ? Is there any correlation between the NDEs and IQ?
This has been reported, and Phyllis Atwater does some of this research. But I'm not, I personally am not aware of any rigorous scientific studies. Think about it. The difficulties of doing that kind of research. We would have to have IQ testing done before and IQ testing done afterwards. Whether even looking at, let's say you want to look at a group of children with near-death experiences, IQs vary given the socioeconomic status, the linguistic abilities of the parents, all sorts of environmental considerations. So I personally would be very skeptical of that kind of research, but I do know that it's been reported anecdotally.
I've noticed people, almost all the people I met, I didn't know them before their experience.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the complicating factor. However, over the years, I've not kids, but a lot of people have told me that their relatives who had near-death experience seemed a lot smarter.
Oh, that's me. One of the persons in our study was a member of Guns N' Roses, and attributes much of his success and blossoming to his near-death experience. So there's no question about, I answered the question very narrowly, has IQ testing been done? There's Olas Swendon is a Swedish, I think he's passed now, but he described his near-death experience when he was 14, and he said, "Let me come back with the information of molecular chemistry."
Mhm.
But remember, he still had to go to graduate school. He still had to study. It's like dreams, but then bring our dreams to the laboratory is essential. And yet he credits the over 100 patents that he has as starting the inspiration from the near-death experience he has when he was 14. And, this is the type of thing that people have had near-death experiences. They go into the helping professions and such as that. All of his patents are things like how you can put more chalk into paper products so you don't have to cut down as many trees to make paper. That's sort of a very typical type of thing that people with near-death experiences think about. They're always, the world is interconnected.
We have two more questions. One is from Parthenia, who's with us on this broadcast right now. All that you mentioned has to do with physical NDEs. My experience occurred when I was a child, but not ill or in any tragical physical situation, but I was terrified emotionally. And that is when I had my experience. I went to bed terrified, begging for someone to help me and be my friend. That's when I entered that place and had that powerful love experience. Are there studies on this kind of NDE? And I'm going to be doing some research on that.
Well, thank you so much for that question, because your question is so dear to my heart that when we understand the neuroscience of spirituality and we understand the neuroscience of near-death experiences, we can then answer your question. And to make, this will be later this month on January 26th, I'm going to give a full webinar on the science of the near-death experience. So, this is a huge question, but just to cut to the chase, we have an area of our brain, perhaps even 30% of our brain, which allows us to communicate with the universe. And human beings have two streams of consciousness. One is ego-bound, which is necessary. How else could we learn our lessons of love if we weren't ego-bound and able to communicate with each other? But during meditation, when the ego is turned off, or at the point of death, when the ego dies, or a period of terror, or a wide variety of clinical situations, that area of the brain becomes activated and allows us to then have, what we call the near-death experience. But that's just simply the spiritual experience that occurs at death. And one of the most beautiful near-death experiences I ever heard was from a young man who had the experience while he was in typing class. And this is back in the days where, he'd learn typing and hear that sort of rhythmical, he got into that sort of trance-like state. And then he had the experience in which he said, I heard the sound of life all wrapped up in a ball that was singing as loud as it could to me. And he said, however, it was so faint that the aware only think they can hear it, and the unaware can't hear it at all. And I think, we've heard of the faint ding of angels. And, that tells us, so oftentimes the valid spiritual experience, it's vague. We're not certain of it because it comes from a type of consciousness which is not ego bound. We're very certain of this experience. I'm certain I'm sitting in a chair. But if an angel appeared, then that's so novel, it's uncertain.
How about one more?
Yes.
Melvin, are you working on any near-death research projects with children's NDEs? If so, how do we contact you? I have had 5 near-death experiences as a child and 1 as an adult.
We have a number of research studies that we are still actively pursuing. I have a research team that I'm working with. I've recently moved to Asheville, North Carolina. I'm working with a very gifted spiritual healers, remote viewers, and those who've had near-death experiences, as well as we just got our statistician who works, that's better than anything else, is to have a statistician as part of a research project. But please contact me through my website. It's melvinmorsemd.com. Just one big long word, melvinmorsemd.com. I want to answer a question which was brought up earlier, but that I didn't. I was asked about the positive effects of the near-death experience. I don't know if this is a positive or negative effect, but you want to know, you know this, Raymond. So I'll just say to the audience rhetorically, if you want to know the valid hallmark of the near-death experience, is see if the person can wear a watch or not. Now, of course, we don't have that many watches anymore, but in our research study, we found that adults who had near-death experiences frequently could not wear watches. Computers often didn't work for them. Vernon Neppy, who I worked with, he would say, I can always tell when you bring that one patient to the office for an interview because all the computers short out whenever that happens. So, we've learned that the near-death experiences causes a change in the electromagnetic frequencies surrounding the body, which can interfere with the very delicate electronics seen in these kinds of things. And I can't tell you how many times I've had fun with people who, they tell me, oh, watches never work for me. They always seem to break. And so just to have fun with them, I'll say, well, so tell me about your near-death experience. What? No, I don't know if that's positive or negative. It's commonly seen with the near-death experience.
Running out of time here. I want to say Mel wrote a book on children's near-death experiences, published in 1998 or 1988.
Still in print.
Still in print. And the name?
Closer to the Light.
Closer to the Light.
And then if those are interested in the neuroscience of the near-death experience, I wrote a book called Where God Lives, is how our brain interacts with the universe. And that's in print. And then I've got another book coming out within the year having to do with the more personal aspects of what I've learned personally from about the near-death experience.
Great. And thank you all so much for being with us tonight. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's just an honor to be able to share this information with you.
Yes.
I consider this to be sacred information. To be able to tell you about patients that I've personally resuscitated and what they've shared with me about the dying process. I have the advantage of hearing these things firsthand, and I want to share these experiences with you.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.